And now joining us on Houston Sports Talk, it's our Astros insider, the Chronicle's Evan Drellich. And boy, Evan, it's been a rough week for the Astros. After winning a bunch of series in a row, they've lost the last 3 series. Can you just kind of break down a little bit about what's happened, what the issues have been for the Astros in the last week and a half?
Well, we knew when they were playing well that it was an unsustainable pace, right? And I think what we've just seen them kind of come back down to earth. For as bad as they were for the first 5 weeks of the season, that was unrealistic. They weren't that bad a team, and they just weren't as good a team as they showed us after that. So I think that's what it is. You know, it's not as though the offense all of a sudden lost the concerns about the strikeouts, particularly with a young lineup. You're going to see the guys go through these ebbs and flows where they're not going to hit. I mean, that's really what's happened last week. They haven't been hitting. And the Rays themselves have been kind of due to go on a run. I think they're certainly a team who qualifies as better than their own record. I think the second half is very interesting. I think just seeing the team kind of go through these peaks and valleys here. Where are they in the second half? You know, do they bottom out? Do they stay at the top? Where are they? Who are they? How do these guys perform? Does the Keuchel, does the Springer go on another run as he did? Who are these guys for real at the end of the year? I think that's kind of to be determined.
Yeah, the pitching staff has kind of broke down a little bit too. The starters for a while there, they seem to be going long into ball games, and they were really pitching well. And some of the guys have kind of fallen off a little bit recently, haven't they? And that's affected the bullpen because then they've got to pick it up and they've got to pitch more innings.
When they were doing well, the rotation was carrying them. Did anyone expect the rotation to continue to be one of the best in baseball throughout the year? No, I think it's kind of realistic what we've seen lately. Luno's favorite analogy of late has been golf, and you know, you can always use that, but you know, you've got to putt well, you've got to drive well. All the different things have to come together, and that really is what happened with the Astros when they were winning. That's not happening right now, and it's not. They're not a 600 team. I think 70 games is going to be our mark. And you were probably going into the season optimistic about 70. That would have been a high mark. I think now they'll get there, and you wonder, could they get a little bit over it? I think that's what that winning streak did.
Just wanted to ask, too, about the young players in the roster, because, as you said, this is a young team that's growing. And Singleton sat out the last game of the Tampa Bay series. He has that power that we've seen, but he's struggling at the plate. Just kind of an adjustment process at the big leagues, isn't it, still for Springer and for Singleton? Sure.
Yeah, and it's going to continue to be. I mean, when you're 22 and 24-year-old fastball hitters, you know, talking to the hitting coach Sean Maley about, I talked to him specifically about Springer. Singleton had just arrived at this point. It was interesting talking to him about Springer and the constant efforts to keep his swing short. They don't really go a day without that being, I guess, a focus is the way to put it. They know his swing can get long, and perhaps he ends up being a streaky hitter in the big leagues, but we don't know. I think you'll take it if he could go on these runs where he rattles off 10 home runs in a month again. It's going to be tough to be a 40 home run hitter if you struggle as you do to this extent, but they're young, and we'll see. I think there's nothing else you can do about it except to hope that they kind of better adjust to major league pitching as they go.
Speaking of patience and the outfield situation, when do you think the Astros' patience with Robbie Grossman ends? He came back and he started playing well a little bit at the beginning, but he's back to being, Robbie Grossman of earlier in the season. He's still hovering around 150, 160. And you got a guy like Domingo Santana who shows a lot of promise in AAA, and he's a guy that I know they're very high on the organization is. What do you think about that?
I don't know if there's what exactly would be the moment that says to them, okay, that's enough. I mean, I know they believe in a number of plate appearances and things of that nature. Some of it might also have to do with Santana, who you look at him and you say, well, let's give him a shot now. This is an argument we've heard with Springer, but I think it's a little bit more valid with him. There's concern about his swing is too long, that if he gets up here, he's just not going to be able to produce in the same way. It's going to happen at some point this year, particularly if Grossman continues to play like this. You know, he's had such a bizarre year. He was in the middle of spring training. We believed he was going to be the number 2 hitter in the lineup. Then he got pulled out of that very quickly without much of an explanation. Pulled into it, and then pulled out of it very quickly. 2 weeks into the season, we got demoted. So he didn't really have a chance then. It's been a tough year for him. I got to believe he's a little bit better than he's played, but yeah, they're not going to put up with this the entire year. No way.
Wanted to ask about Carlos Correa, the Astros' top overall prospect in the system, who was injured at Lancaster, sliding into third base, and is going to be out a period of time. What does this do for his timetable? Because we were all expecting the call up to Double-A around the All-Star break time, the Major League All-Star break time, somewhere in that period, and then maybe even at the beginning of next year have a shot to come out and make the club out of spring training or go immediately to Triple-A. He'll still be going to the Arizona Fall League, but does this set him back?
There's no way it doesn't set him back to some extent. It doesn't mean he can't make up for it. He's the one guy where, the Astros are very firm and have shown under this administration an adherence to getting guys to every level, right? They don't like skipping guys. But because he is so polished, he's the one guy where at least this is my opinion, I think it becomes he's an easier guy to skip, right? If he's dominating, maybe you put him at AAA sooner than you would somebody else. But they haven't done that. They didn't do that with him this year, right? They could have pulled him out of Lancaster a month ago, the way he was playing. But they wanted him to stay at the level and master the level. I think that's what it comes down to. If they keep him at this very steady progression, ultimately, yes, this will set him back a bit of time. If at some point they decide that, we can skip him a little bit. One thing to note with this, the questions of Super 2, of control, all the service time matters, those aren't going to disappear with him. We can have conversations about it in spring training, and I'm sure there'll be stories written about, does he have a chance to make the team? My guess is it's going to be fat chance, because it's going to be the same situation we saw with Springer, with Singleton, et cetera, where they want to extend their control as far as they can. And as you could understand, their desire to do that would be.
Is there anybody right now that the Astros you think are definitely looking at as we approach the trading deadline here in the next month or so? Is there anybody on the Astros roster you think they're looking to maybe trade down at that point? What do you think is going to happen with that as far as some of the Astros, I guess, quote unquote, veterans right now?
I think the only piece they could kind of reasonably move would come out of the bullpen. The tougher question is a Fowler and a Castro, guys that are getting closer to free agency that will become expensive. Are they part of the long-term plan? Even in spring training, Jeff Luhnow said that they've got to treat this trade deadline differently. I think by the trade deadline, there's not going to be any question that this team remains out of it. For a little bit of May, you might have thought, I wonder if they could actually make this interesting. Even if they're within a striking distance, I think the front office is smart enough to know it's not going to happen with the roster they have this year. But at the same time, if you want to avoid an end-of-season tailspin, you really can't sell off too many of your parts, and they're committed, at least verbally, to being a better team this year. I think you could safely move one of the relievers. If somebody came calling for Tony Sipp or Chad Qualls and gave you a piece that you liked enough, I think you'd do it, but you can't do too much of that. Would Fowler or Castro get moved? I think at the right price. Castro hasn't played particularly well enough to merit probably the price the Astros would want. And with Fowler, he's been so good that if you trade him, what message does that send to the fan base? So it's going to be a tricky deadline. I wouldn't be surprised to see them sell off a couple parts. It's harder to see them selling a core piece this year.
Speaking of the bullpen, what about the situation with Albers, Bass, and even Crane? Any updates on that right now?
It seems like Albers and Bass both could potentially make it back here before the break. I know Albers just showed up on the road trip, which I wasn't on, so I didn't speak to him there. But he had a setback. Albers in particular, his injury was never supposed to take as long as it did. I remember when he first got hurt in Seattle, his first trip to Seattle, I think it was April, and he thought it was nothing, and it's clearly just dragged out.
You talked in a column about the strange major league time that Asher Wojciechowski has because of a set of circumstances. Can you talk a little bit about that? And do you think in the end, does this mean that there's a good chance that we could actually see him this season? Does that help his case of actually getting up at some point, or what's going to happen with Asher?
At the start of the year, let's go back to spring training. Would you expect to see Asher Wojciechowski on the major league team this season? Yes. And I think that still holds true if he comes back and he pitches well, and there's some need for him at the major league level. And why wouldn't there be a need for a starter at some point later in the year? The service time thing, No, I don't think because he's earned a little bit, they would decide to keep him away. As I tried to point out in that story, he did nothing wrong. It's just kind of a peculiar setup with the CBA and service time. The fact that a guy who's never played a day in the majors could have more service time than someone else who has been in the majors and has performed in one's mind, you would think deserves more. But you understand why they set it up, because if this protection wasn't there, teams would manipulate injuries and it would create a very messy situation. It's just kind of a little bit of an oddity.
Hey, Evan, I wanted to ask about the Astros draft because it occurred earlier in June. They selected Brady Aiken, #1 overall, then picked up Derek Fisher, and they signed J.D. Davis and A.J. Reed and even Jacob Nix, the pitcher, in the 5th round here recently. What's kind of been the thought of the organization's haul?
I think it's been good. It goes back to a question I asked somebody with the Astros the other day. Well, when do you judge a draft? They said 5 years later, right? But I asked somebody else, a former Astros person, when do you judge a draft? And they said, well, what changes is the player. You can only make your decisions at the time based on the information you have. So, if a player shoots up and starts doing great, do you then go back and credit the front office that picked him, or do you? It's a question of how you want to evaluate a draft. I think the consensus so far has been that the Astros did a good job, and when you're picking first overall, particularly for a 3rd straight year, you need to do a good job. This is what the Astros are hanging their hat on. I mean, they have to hit on these guys, and they went very college heavy. Only 4 high school players, some junior college players mixed in there, who are, you could argue, are kind of closer developmentally to high schoolers. They went for polished college guys, along with Aiken, and we'll see. Aiken's in Houston now. He's probably going to be announced at some point this week. He has to go through his physicals. There'll be more draft talk coming up this week.
Wanted to just ask just really quickly too, because you had an article that came out about Ed Wade taking credit for Springer and some of the others who came through the organization and made it to the major leagues here. Can you kind of go over that, about what Ed has said?
I don't know if Ed is standing up and saying these guys are all mine. I do think that Astros management, as well as outside entities, including even the Chronicle, have kind of perpetuated this idea that what this administration took over was in terrible shape. The reality was it wasn't deep, and it was in bad shape. I don't think anybody would say it was in good shape. I think that would certainly be a stretch for anybody to say. A lot of the talent was at the lower levels of the minor leagues. But, if you go down the roster of who has kind of led this revival of the Astros, a lot of them are guys that Ed Wade's administration brought in. Springer, Singleton. Jose Altuve was brought in by the prior administration. Jason Castro. VR, although he's had a bad season. Santana. The trade with the Phillies, the Pence trade, looms very large. The point was that not that Ed Wade deserves the entirety of the credit for the turnaround, but his group realistically did more than they've been acknowledged to have done, I think.
Yeah, it was a tough situation that Ed Wade had, and he was trying to hold up the sinking ship with not a whole lot of weapons to start with. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and there were circumstances of selling and all that. I mean, there's no question that they did terrible in some drafts. Prior to that, the 2007 draft was awful. What Ed Wade was working with at the time, did he hit as well as he should have on the Michael Bourne trade? Probably not. Does he make up for that with the Pence trade? I think you could argue he did. Well, it certainly wasn't perfect, but with them trying to sell, he gave the building blocks. I mean, we talk about all these guys, DeLion the Shields coming up, Mike Foltynewicz. Well, those aren't Luno guys; those are Ed Wade guys. The rebirth of the farm system in many ways began before the administration took over.
You've been listening to Houston Chronicle Astros beat writer Evan Drellich. Check him out on chron.com or follow him on Twitter @Evan Drellich. Pleasure to have you again, Evan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks guys.
Evan.
You can listen to our podcast interviews and get more of our Astros coverage on HoustonSportsTalk.net.